Welcome to Real Bible. I'm Carol Sallee, and this video is produced by the Sallee Group. In each Real Bible segment, we'll strive to tackle real truth from a real book and apply it to real life. In this Christmas-themed session of Real Bible, I'm presenting 4 different segments under the title, 4 Roads to Bethlehem. This short study examines 4 Old Testament women in Jesus' genealogy from Matthew chapter 1. The last 2 segments, then the first one, we studied Tamar, who pretended she was a prostitute and ended up having twin sons with her father-in-law. Then we looked at Rahab, who was a prostitute. And today we'll examine Ruth, who begins her story as an outcast among God's people. And then next week, just a heads up, we'll look at Bathsheba, a soldier's wife who had a questionable sexual encounter with King David. Well, Matthew, just to remind you, he wrote to a primarily Jewish audience, which is why the inclusion of these women is so unusual. So we have to ask, why are they included? Well, to continue God's path of revealing what he wants us to know of him and to establish that Jesus came for all people. You know, it reminds me, as I was thinking about Ruth's story, of something with my daughters. Now, I'm old enough that when I had children, my children were raised on just my trying to figure it out. And I had a book about this thick that was written by Dr. Spock, and not the Dr. Spock of Star Trek. It was a baby doctor, I guess is what he was. But now I have 2 daughters, and between them, they have my 5 grandchildren, and my daughters are so researched. They have got support groups on Facebook, and they have the internet, and they have the World Wide Web, and there's just so many ways that they can get information on how to raise children. Well, one of the things that they found out in their reading was that you need to be very careful if you're going to have your infant do the cry it out method. And I'm not trying to get into a debate on whether you should let your child cry it out or if you should always go and pick up your child. But one of the things that they decided they would do was that they did not want their child, who was so obviously unsettled and most likely crying, to feel completely isolated from their parents. And so what they would do is, of course, they had the baby monitor pointed at the child, and then they would just be this voice that would come over the baby monitor into the child's bedroom. And this is what they would say. They would say their child's name, and then they would say, "You are loved. You are not alone. You are cared for." I mean, they wanted their child to know, you are not alone, you are loved, you are cared for. Now, I'm not sure what it would feel like to have this disembodied voice coming and saying that to me, but I will tell you right now, those are phrases that we all, in the depths of our soul, we want someone to speak that to us. You are loved, you are not alone, you are cared for. When the book of Ruth, we're going to uncover a woman who discovers those things about herself, that she is loved, she is not alone, and that she is cared for by the God of heaven. Well, the book of Ruth is in the Old Testament, and it's one of only 2 books in the entire Bible named after a woman. The other book is Esther. The book of Ruth opens with the story of a Jewish family. There's a husband and wife, Elimelech and Naomi, and they have 2 sons. They are from Bethlehem, and Bethlehem means house of bread. And I love that because the bread of life, Jesus Christ, was born in the house of bread, Bethlehem. Well, they were from the tribe of Judah. And if you've been with us on the last 2 segments, then you know the importance of any time it says they're from the tribe of Judah. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had 12 sons. His 4th son with Leah, that's the son from which Jesus' line will come as part of this genealogy. Well, one of the saddest books in all the Bible is in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. It says this, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did whatever he wanted." And I would have to ask humanity, how's that working out for you when everyone does whatever they want? It's chaotic when that happens. Well, that's the last verse of the book of Judges, and then we step into the book of Ruth. And it says in Ruth 1, chapter 1, verse 1, "During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land." And one of the things that we need to understand about that famine that was in the promised land, that the children of Israel, last segment, we looked at that. They fought and they came and they conquered and they are living in this promised land, was that God told them, you have to be obedient. As long as you stay obedient to me, I will leave you in the land. But if your disobedience gets too great, then I will remove you from this land. Well, it says in Deuteronomy 11, verse 16 and 17, just those words. God promised to bless them if they obeyed. But if they turned to idols, he promised to shut the heavens so that it will not rain and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. So the children of Israel, we saw it at the end of Judges, they're being so disobedient. The famine comes. It's a form of punishment against the Israelites. Well, this family, they left Bethlehem for Moab. So we've got Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons. And it wasn't that far away from Bethlehem, but it was still a foreign place for an Israelite. The Moabites, just some quick history, and this is kind of, it's that history, some of it in the Old Testament is really hard for us to understand. But in Genesis chapter 19, Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, and Lot's oldest daughter, this is the whole Sodom and Gomorrah story where they were told they needed to leave because God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and 3 other cities of the plain for their incredible wickedness. And Lot and his wife and 2 daughters, they run and they're kind of headed to the hills. And they had been told, when you leave, don't look back. Don't look back with longing on the life that you left. Well, Lot's wife, she couldn't help but look, and she turned into a pillar of salt. So Lot ends up holed up in a cave in the mountains with his daughters. And the daughters get into a discussion. This is the end of our family. We don't have children. This will be all that there is for us. And so, again, the Bible just reports this. And so we don't have time to spend on how odd this is for us, but it's just recorded as a happening. Both girls got their dad drunk, had sexual relations with him, and then they each ended up having a son. Well, one of the sons is where the Moabites came from, and the other son is where the Ammonites came from. Well, the Moabites in particular were very, very challenging for the Israelites. They did not worship the Hebrew God. They worshiped a God to whom they sacrificed their children. I mean, that's how wicked they were. Well, God spoke some of his harshest words against the Moabites and the Ammonites. In Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 through 6, it says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam to pronounce a curse on you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live." It is like God is saying about the Moabites and the Ammonites, do not have anything to do with them. That it would take 10 generations to get their blood out of your family line. So just a few verses into the book of Ruth, the family had been living in Moab for 10 years. So remember, they would have known that scripture from Deuteronomy. They would have known that they shouldn't have been with the Moabites. But they've lived there for 10 years. The 2 sons had married Moabite women, which they were not supposed to do. And then the dad and the sons had all died. So now Naomi, the mother-in-law, was left to fend for herself as a foreigner, a woman, and a widow with 2 widowed Moabite daughters-in-law. So there's the situation. Well, Naomi, she heard that God had come to the aid of his people in Israel by providing food for them. And I'll tell you, God news travels fast. Good news travels fast. God news travels even faster. Well, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to leave Moab to return to Naomi's home in Bethlehem in the land of Judah. However, Naomi encouraged her daughters-in-law to go back to their mother's homes and telling them, you are no longer under any obligation to me. Well, when Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah indicated they wanted to stay with Naomi, she basically said, I am too old to get a husband for myself, much less get a husband and have sons with him so I can provide you with another husband. She also says, I don't want to rub off on you. Because in ancient times, this kind of tragedy meant to the Israelites that the person did not have God's blessing on his or her lives. So to Naomi, it seemed to her that God had turned his hand against her. Well, Orpah decided to return to her family, but Ruth made a commitment to Naomi. And interestingly, it's a commitment that we hear a lot in our modern day wedding ceremonies, but it is a daughter-in-law speaking to her mother-in-law. And Ruth says this, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So Naomi and Ruth, they arrive in Bethlehem, and Naomi, after 10 years of living in Moab and having all that sorrow, she looks so different, so worn down by her circumstances that the women of the city, they say, can this be Naomi? Naomi had returned widowed, impoverished, childless, with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. And the last segment, we talked about how every time you see Rahab, it talks about Rahab, the prostitute. Over and over in the book of Ruth, it says Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess. Ruth, she's from Moab. It's because the narration wants us to understand that she's an unlikely candidate for God to use in his redemption story of mankind. Well, Naomi, she tells these women of her city, call me Mara, for I am bitter. Now, I understand her grief and her sorrow. Our family, through the years, whenever something has happened that has really caused some bitterness and we're trying to find some humor in the situation, one of us will invariably say, call me Mara, for I am bitter. Well, that is kind of her attitude. And what she's saying is, I went away full, but God brought me back empty. God has pronounced judgment on me. God has afflicted me. Now, I can kind of feel for Naomi. But one of the things that she's forgetting is that we serve a sovereign and providential God. And he has a plan and a purpose for these two women. She just doesn't know that yet. Well, Ruth's in an awful situation too. However, in addition to having the same sorrow, she's now going to become the foreigner in a strange land with strange practices. And she was a destitute widow in the company of a bitter woman, so bitter that she wanted to change her name to a name that means bitterness. Well, they arrived in Bethlehem at the barley harvest. It says, as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, if a timing is mentioned in the Bible, it matters. Even in what appeared to be discouraging times, God was beginning to unfold his plan to bring about the redemption of the world. When Ruth chapter 2, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go and glean in the fields. Mosaic law required that those landowners that had these fields and all this harvest, they were required to leave portions for the poor and for the alien, for the stranger that had come into their midst. And Naomi, when she hears what Ruth is offering, she says, go ahead, my daughter. So there's an affection that's really building between these two women. Well, verse 1 of Ruth chapter 2 did mention that Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, Boaz. And Boaz is described as a prominent man of noble character. Well, Ruth, she goes out to glean. Remember, she doesn't know this area. And I'm going to use air quotes here. She just happens to end up in one of Boaz's fields. In Hebrew, it actually reads like this. Her chance chanced upon. Or in other words, it happened to happen. The writer of the book of Ruth wants us to see the irony that all of this is under the sovereign and providential direction of God. The word sovereign, God is most high sovereign, ruler of the universe and the affairs of men. God is active in big things. There are billions and billions of stars in our galaxy. But he's also active in small things like molecules and atoms and snowflakes, each one being different. Well, the same power that controls the creation is in perfect control of our lives. He moves in mundane ways, like insignificant details, like it's a barley harvest, it's a particular field. But he also moves in mysterious ways. Here's a quote. This is the wonder of God's sovereignty. Working behind the scenes, he is moving and pushing and rearranging events until he brings out of even the most difficult setting a decision that will set his perfect plan in place. With Tamar, the catchphrase was God right straight in crooked lines. With Rahab, our catchphrase was something no good becomes good in God's hands. And with Ruth, it's this. He makes great doors swing on little hinges. Something big is about to happen at the barley harvest. And then the word providential. It comes from two words. One, pro, means before or ahead of time. And videntia, it's where we get video comes from. It means to see. So you put that together and it means that a providential God sees ahead of time and provides before the need is even known. It's the means by which he directs all things towards his purposes. I want to show you this as an illustration. This is a cross stitch that a precious friend from our years in Colorado, she made for me. And she was a beautiful cross stitcher. I don't know if you have ever put your hand to that. But here's one of the things that's so amazing. Charlotte Baker, there's your shout out. Amazing about Charlotte's cross stitch. It's even beautiful on the back. I mean, I know you can't necessarily understand what all the words say, but I don't see any funky knots. Like when I tried cross stitching, there were all kinds of knots on the back, tangled thread, and always there was a thread that would go from the bottom all the way up to the top on the back. I don't know if a kid ran in and interrupted me or if I just lost count, but Charlotte was so good that both sides of her cross stitch are beautiful. Here's the point that I want you to see. We are living life on the back side of the tapestry of our life. God is up in heaven and he is weaving the story of our life, and he knows where the colors need to go. He knows what the images need to look like. Now, every now and then it does feel like God kind of goes, hey, and he gives us a little peek, and we have this time where we think, oh, that's why that happened. That needed to happen so that this could happen in God's plan. But most of the time, we're living on the backside of this tapestry, and we're not really sure what it is that God is doing. And there are things that don't look like they belong, and something is a big mistake that is made. But we have to trust that God knows the beauty of the picture that he is making in the story of our lives. And these two women are going to begin to learn this. Well, under Jewish law, Ruth had the right to glean in any harvest field. On her first day of work, Ruth chanced upon a field that belonged to Boaz, who just happened to be from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, it happened to happen. So Ruth shows up, she's in this field. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. And Boaz comes along and he greets his workers and he notices this young woman. And he asked his foreman, whose young woman is that? And the foreman explained that this Moabite woman had asked if she could glean the fields, and except for a short break, she had worked hard all day. Well, Boaz indicated to Ruth that she should stay under his protection and provision, gleaning with his servant girls and drinking from the water jars his men filled. Ruth was so overcome by Boaz's kindness toward her that she felt compelled to ask him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me, a foreigner?" And Boaz responded. He said, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So going beyond what was expected, Boaz invited Ruth to the table to eat with the harvesters. And then Ruth ate until she was full and then returned to Naomi with her leftovers and all that she had gleaned. And it ended up being several weeks' supply for two widows. Well, at this point, Naomi begins to recognize the sovereign, providential hand of God. I don't know where this quote comes from, but it's one I love. When you don't like the outlook, try the uplook. Naomi's outlook was bleak, but she looks up to God and she begins to see that he is working on her behalf and on the behalf of Ruth. We go into Ruth chapter 3. Naomi suggested to Ruth that Ruth should ask Boaz to marry her as the next of kin. Now, get how she coaches her daughter-in-law. She says, Naomi to Ruth, "Wash and perfume yourself, put on your best clothes, go to the threshing floor. Don't let him know you are there until he is done eating and drinking. When he lies down, go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will let you know what to do next." So Ruth is not accustomed to their customs, but Naomi knows what needs to happen. Ruth did as she was instructed. She asked Boaz to spread the corner of his garment over her because she believed that he was her kinsman redeemer. Now, it's so interesting that the blessing he just gave her talked about being under the shadow of God's wing. And now Ruth is asking Boaz, can I come into the shadow of your wing? Will you take me in? Because Mosaic law had a provision, it's not the first time we've heard that in this study, to preserve the family name. If a husband died and there was no son to perpetuate the family name, the nearest of kin was obligated to marry the widow and have children with her. But there were 3 requirements for a kinsman redeemer. He had to be near of kin, able to redeem, and willing to redeem. So he had to be in the right place, with all the right resources, and a willing heart. Boaz could not have redeemed Ruth if he hadn't been able to pay. Ruth caught his eye, and now hope has shown up. Orpah could have been redeemed too, but she chose her old life. Ruth's decision to follow God and to identify herself with his people brought her rich reward when she became an ancestress of our Savior. Now, while Boaz was willing to marry Ruth, he was those things. He was near of kin, able to redeem, and willing to redeem. He actually knew there was a kinsman redeemer closer than him. And Ruth 3:18 says that Boaz was not going to rest until he resolved this matter. He was going to resolve it on that day. We all need someone to rescue us from our desperate situation, and he won't rest. Jesus is a close relative. He's a son of man. He is able to pay the price, and he wants to pay the price. He has a great desire to be our Redeemer. Jesus could not have redeemed us if he hadn't been able to pay, hadn't been willing to pay. We have caught his eye, and hope has shown up. Sarah Groves has a song, and this is at one of the verses. It says, hope has a way of turning its face to us just when we least expect it. You walk in a room, you look out a window, and something there leaves you breathless. You say to yourself, it's been a while since I've felt this, but it feels like it might be hope. And then in Ruth 4, the closer man, the closer kinsman redeemer, he could have bought the land, but Ruth came with the deal. And the man did not want to do it. He did not want to take on Ruth. So, weird custom, he gave Boaz his sandal, which meant that Boaz could marry Ruth. And this is about 126 years before King David was born. Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and God gave them a son. So the lineage goes Salmon and Rahab, Boaz and Ruth, Obed, Jesse, then David and Bathsheba, and then many centuries later, we come to Jesus Christ. So we have this great grandmother to King David. And so it was that a foreigner from a condemned country was brought into relationship with God. During one of the darkest times in Israel's history, a most unlikely young woman gave birth to a boy named Obed, who would father a son named Jesse, who would have a son named David, the king who would bring Israel back to God and become one of the most famous ancestors to the Messiah. Eventually, the King of Kings will come, and this Moabite woman proved the extent of God's grace and his intent to include all people. This story is ultimately about the coming Messiah. If God can accept unlikely people like these and incorporate them into his plan of salvation, there is hope for all of us. Because in God's redemptive plan, nothing just happens to happen. So what can we learn from Ruth's road? Ruth is for women who have experienced some of life's greatest hurts and unforgiving situations, and they wonder if God cares. Ruth is for women who, because of their struggles, have lost sight of God to the point of being bitter toward him. Ruth is for women who need to remember that God's unseen hand is behind the scenes, taking care with our lives and steering us according to his good purpose, whether we see it or not. Ruth is for women who believe in God's purposes for their lives, even when things look bleak. Ruth is for women who see glimmers of hope in the midst of gloom. And she's for women who want to be in the right place with the right resources and a willing heart because they want to be used by and for God to further his plan of redemption. And finally, Ruth is for women who need to know you are loved, you are not alone, you are cared for. Because you see, It's not that far to Bethlehem.